very good morning to you. I'm Howard Feldman. This is the Synthesis podcast. This morning, we've got the privilege of chatting to John Steenhuisen. He is a South African politician, as you know. He is the leader of the opposition in the National Assembly and has been since October 2019, and the interim federal leader of the Democratic Alliance. John, thank you for taking the time to speak to us this morning.
Great to be with you, Howard, and thanks for the privilege to be with you to chat through the various things we're going to travail today.
All right. So, John, we speak fairly frequently, and when we spoke a few weeks ago, you indicated a significant amount of support for the ANC's plan around COVID-19, around the crisis. Currently, there's a sense that you, along with many of us and many South Africans, are starting to diverge slightly away from full and unequivocal support. Is that the case? Where does the DA and where do you stand around this?
Well, look, I think that we've been very supportive of government's efforts from the beginning. It was the right thing to do to lock down hard and to lock down early. But we were always of the view that the hard lockdown was not sustainable in the longer term. And what it's essentially meant to do is to buy you time to prepare your health response and to have a plan to manage the virus going forward. It's simply impossible for any economy in the world to be hard locked down for 18 to 24 months. There'd be absolutely nothing left of it. And that was behind the smart lockdown model, which we presented to government, which looked at a phased approach to open up the economy using data-led research to enable you to open up and then close down again if needs be. If you suddenly have a spike, you're able to manage it. Obviously, government took a lot of that on board, but their level 4 lockdown is very different to our level 4 lockdown. You know, we proposed a far wider opening of the economy and allowing a far less stringent criteria for business to operate. Any business that could practice PPE, personal protective equipment, could manage social distancing, and was able to screen employees and to be able to fill out a risk assessment form should be allowed to open. And so, for instance, there have been some really bizarre decisions made over the course of the government's level 4 lockdown, which essentially can be described as level 5 hard lockdown with running shorts and a military curfew. And that's essentially the difference. And there's been some really weird decisions made, particularly around tobacco and alcohol, and some very bizarre decisions around this clampdown on e-commerce, which should be the easiest way for citizens to access goods and services using the internet, reducing the human interaction and the exchange of money and credit cards and the like. And it's just been completely bizarre that e-commerce has been throttled in the way that it has, when it just makes sense to be using it to allow businesses that can get their products online to be able to provide those to customers in a safer way. So I think that a lot of the goodwill and cooperation that had been fostered over the first 3 or 4 weeks of combating COVID has evaporated because I think some of the petty and unjustifiable regulations and the like. And I think that's it's unfortunate, and it could actually be the biggest undermining of the fight against COVID-19, as we're starting to see many citizens just rebelling against what they regard as arbitrary regulations.
Well, there seems to be this an introduction of the notion of equity, and perhaps it's misplaced, and that's kind of what you're saying, is that the government seems to be suggesting that, well, it's unfair for one company not to be able to operate, but another to be able to operate. And instead of looking at it from a economic perspective and from a COVID perspective, it's introduced this concept of fairness, which confuses everything, I think.
Well, I think fairness is the wrong criteria. There's nothing fair about the COVID virus. There's nothing equitable about it. But there's also nothing fair about killing an economy and destroying the lives and livelihoods of many South Africans. And I think it's dangerous when government starts picking winners and losers within industries and within the economy, because history has shown us that this is a recipe for disaster, that you cannot centrally plan an economy. You've got to allow business the free hand to be able to do what it needs to do. And if a business can operate in this environment, there's no reason it couldn't and shouldn't be allowed to open and trading, provided that the practices are being enforced. And I think that's very, very important. There's a sort of binary narrative that you either open the economy or you have hard lockdown. That it's not a binary narrative. You can do both. You can manage the virus and the spread of it, and you can also open up the economy. And I think that's what underpins our smart lockdown model. So, for instance, hairdressers. I know that's a very
well,
big,
not for me, not
not for you.
Not necessarily. It's not my biggest concern, right?
No, there's no reason why a hairdresser, for instance, cannot, using gloves and a face shield, using an appointment system where no customers ever have to interact with each other, and getting customers to wear a face mask, could not carry on operating. Instead, they're shut down and will only be able to operate in level 1. Now, many of these are small business people who run their own businesses. They're not going to be able to sustain a 6-7 month break with no income. And so there is nothing fair at the moment, but the fairest thing you can do, and the fairest approach that you can take, is saying that if it is possible for you to open under these circumstances, practicing social distancing, using PPE, and being able to screen customers and staff, you should be allowed to open your business. I think that's the fairest way. There's been nothing fair about the hard lockdown either. Big shopping centers and stores have been open, while many other people have not been open during that period. And so if you start trying to introduce fairness and equity into it, you actually end up with silly regulations that become very, very hard to justify in the long term.
And of course, the biggest danger there is that a successful lockdown depends on people adhering to it. And people don't adhere to things ultimately that are irrational. We need to be convinced, or we need to believe that the decisions that are being made are rational decisions. The minute they feel arbitrary and prescriptive for no absolute, no clear reason, that's when people start defying a lockdown, really.
Well, I mean, that's the point, and these things are a compact between the people and the government. And you strengthen that compact by sharing information with people in an open and transparent way. And I don't think we've seen nearly enough of that. That you make regulations that are justifiable from an economic and epidemiological basis. So there's a rational basis, and once it's explained to citizens, they understand it. The truth of the matter is there's not enough army or police personnel in the country if every citizen just says, well, stuff this, I'm no longer abiding by it. You can't lock up every citizen. You can't arrest every South African. And so it's not sustainable, the authoritarian approach in the longer term. What you want to do is to create the buy-in. And when you undermine that compact with silly regulations, it is actually the biggest threat to us being able to combat the virus.
I agree with that.
And
I agree.
People like Nkosi Dlamini Zuma and Ibrahim Patel, I think, have done more to undermine the lockdown and the compliance with it than any of the surfers or people buying rotisserie chicken, or the guy scarving a box of cigarettes during this lockdown. And they really need to rethink before they lose that compact completely, and you end up with a wide-scale rebellion that just simply won't be able to be policed.
Do you think that last week the president's Twitter account tweeted out some very, very bizarre things about his very dear friends in Iran and, of course, Cuba, as well as Venezuela? And I was quite intrigued by why he would have done that. Of course, there's many people, many countries from around the world, including the United States, offering support. And yet, whereas those were acknowledged, it certainly wasn't done in the same warm, enthusiastic way. And I was quite perplexed by that. And I tried to figure out what that meant. And I just wondered, given the fact that he doesn't have full support of his own caucus, and the fact that we had just had that very bizarre speech by Dlamini Zuma that also seemed to contradict him, do you think that he is battling to control or struggling to control his own party through this, given all of the factors?
Absolutely. And I think it's manifested its way in a number of things. You would have noticed in his speech 2 weeks ago, he made specific reference to radical economic transformation. Now, that's not his wicket. That's his opponent's wicket. And yet there he was saying that, we've got to have this. I think those messages to some really unsavory dictators around the world were unfortunate. I mean, to call Maduro your brother when he's caused wide-scale suffering to his people.
Well, that's why I suggested if he's your brother, then perhaps he should, our president should check up on his nieces and nephews because they're starving.
Yeah, exactly. Because, they'll be starving to death. And that's exactly it. But, the ANC have always hung out in a bad neighborhood, whether it's the Gaddafis of the world, the Suhartos in Indonesia, the Chavezes in Venezuela. They've never met a dictator they didn't like. And, it should worry us because, as you say, there are other countries that are really good friends to South Africa and want to help, places like the United States, Israel, and it's almost like they're treated differently, and that we sort of bend the knee to these dictators when, in fact, our constitution and our story as South Africa should be setting out a very different path for those countries. And it's also typified by the way we behave at the United Nations. And I think it's terrifying when you look at some of the votes South Africa has been involved in the United Nations, always falling on the wrong side of the argument. And, even things like, gay rights, they're bending the knee to countries like Uganda and, undermining our own constitution and the value set that should be setting our moral compass as a country. Instead, we always sort of tend to lean on the side of the authoritarian dictator or the suppressor of rights.
Speaking of the constitutional rights, of course, one of the dangers around a time like this is that there is a natural and in some ways understandable limitation on the rights that we normally enjoy as we try and deal with something that is very significant, almost like a war situation. What is your feeling around the balance that is being achieved or not achieved at the moment in this area?
Well, I think the balance is not balanced at all. I don't think there is a balance. I think it's gone completely over the top. I think we forget we're not in a state of emergency. We're in a state of disaster. So a military curfew where everyone is confined to their homes under military guard in the evenings is not a feature of a functioning, effective democratic society. And also it's not necessary. The Human Science Research Council showed very clearly that there was a 99% compliance with the regulations. And so it's not like you're dealing with a non-compliant citizenry. South Africans have played their part and have now been rewarded for that with a military curfew. I think we've seen some really unfortunate incidents of police abuse, of SANDF abuse, and just, the authoritarianism that's starting to creep in. And, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance. And, we owe it to this generation and generations to come to ensure that we are the watchmen on the walls of democracy and that we don't allow an insurgency into the civil rights and civilian rights of South African citizens. And I just think that it's been really disappointing to see the cases. We had the ridiculous situation for 2 weeks where we had more deaths from police and SANDF abuse than from the virus itself. We had the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations saying that South Africa's heavy-handed approach is not the right way to go. And again, I think it comes to that trust and compact between citizens and their government. Trust people. Don't treat them like children. Treat them like adults. Give them the information they need so they can understand why decisions are being made. We can't live under a military curfew. It is wrong for the security services to be abusing their powers in the way that they are. And we must, as citizens, every one of us, even if we're not involved in politics, we must stand up for what is right, and we must guard against the permanence of the temporary, because I think there's some ministers and some in authority that are really enjoying the power that has been given to them during this time. And we must keep reminding them that this is a disaster. It's not a state of emergency. And these are temporary powers that are not going to be extended going forward.
So what do you suggest citizens do? I mean, you're not surely encouraging people to break curfew and find a way to buy illicit cigarettes.
No, not at all. And I mean, I would never encourage anyone to break the law. But I just think that we must not be lulled into a sense that this is the new normal. I think it's very easy in situations like this for us to accept soldiers standing at the end of our street and accept being, shoved and pushed around by police officers. And we must understand that this is not normal. These are very different times, and that there has to be a line in the sand going forward, and that we don't accept for a moment longer than we have to the measures that are being put in place.
Could you cite an example, perhaps, of a country around the world where you think that style of lockdown or that approach to COVID-19 has been successful?
Well, I think that if one looks at Germany, I think it's a very, very good example. What they've done from the beginning is be open, absolutely, and frank with their citizens. They publish the data in a transparent way, and they share with citizens why they need to be doing what they need to be doing, and why lockdowns are important, why social distancing is important. And it's a far more collaborative approach. And when you have the buy-in model,
I'm sorry, just to interrupt. You're treating your citizens like adults, not like children, and unfortunately, that's the danger of the approach that we're in at the moment.
Absolutely. And so you look at some of the Nordic countries as well. There's a high regard for citizens' freedoms and rights, and that they are and they're respected even in the midst of a disaster. But for me, the big thing is sharing the data. It is an outrage that to date we still don't know the data, the modeling that government is using to justify what they're doing. And the Western Cape government has now moved to a situation where that data is being at a provincial level provided on a website now, so any citizen can log in and see where we're at, what the spike is, what the reproduction rate is, what hospital beds capacity, what the take-up in ICU is, what the deaths are. Treating your citizens as children and keeping them in the dark is the worst thing you can do. Giving citizens the power of the knowledge means that you create a very powerful partner in combating the virus. Treating them like children eventually incites, like all children do, a rebellion.
Do you think there's been a shift? Because certainly in the beginning, the sense that I got was that they were being fairly transparent. We were getting the information. We were hearing from Professor Karim. We were getting information. Now there seems to be a little bit of an obscure approach to sharing. Has there been a shift, or were we never really seeing this in the first place?
We were never really given the modeling up front. We've only really had one proper sharing of the information done by Professor Karim in that excellent presentation that he did. And I think that's what we should have been having more of. Rather, we should have had more Professor Karim and less NDZ and Patel, because I think we would be in a far better place now. And I think that people have a respect for Professor Karim and the leveling that he did with why we're doing what we need to do. That's not borne out. And I think that's why you started to see the shift, is that as the information has dried up and we've been getting diktats rather than information, you've started to see the cooperation levels and go down, and the frustration levels start to rise.
There's been a lot of articles recently, or especially in the last couple of days, where actuaries, doctors have come together to say the bigger concern, perhaps than COVID-19, is the economic fallout. I'm not sure I'm absolutely convinced. I mean, certainly the articles that I've read make very, very good points, but unfortunately or fortunately, you don't want to judge a government on the success of containing a virus. In other words, because there's been a relatively low number, perhaps it seems that they overreached. But obviously, the economic concern and the fallout around the economy, we've seen a number of insolvencies in the last couple of days. Yes, indeed, some of them were on the edge anyway. This perhaps might have just pushed them over. But the amount of jobs being lost, the loss to the revenue services over the arbitrary decisions around cigarettes and alcohol, it's all very, very alarming. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I described, the small hill that is COVID-19, and we'll get over that. We will beat the virus. I mean, there will be eventually be a vaccine or a treatment for it. So we'll get over that. But when we get over that hill, there's a huge mountain that's before us, and that's the economic recovery. Because we mustn't forget, we were very low in the water going into this crisis. We've been in a technical recession for 6 years. The economy was in a bad shape, before the virus hit us. That COVID has now hit us like a wave going over the bow in a boat that was very, very low in the water. And it's got the real threat to push us under. And so that is why 2 weeks into the lockdown, I started speaking out quite vociferously about the importance of beating the twin threat to life in South Africa. And that is the spread of the virus on the one hand and a grinding economic depression on the other. And I was treated as a heretic at the time, but it now seems to be the mainstream concern is what's going to happen with the economy. And the reason it's so important, and it's borne out by what we've seen over the course of the last 4 weeks, just how fragile so many of our households are in South Africa. 4 weeks of lockdown have essentially brought, I would say, the vast majority of South African households to their knees in terms of being able to provide food and resources to keep those family units viable in the future. And so we mustn't underestimate the death from starvation, exposure, and the like that could result from a grinding economic depression. And certainly if one looks at some of the scary figures that are being put out by National Treasury, talking about a 17% contraction in the economy. Some have pegged it worse. We're looking at, an average of 10 million jobs being lost. These are serious, serious concerns. And the thing that's really going to bite hard is that the poor have borne the brunt of the recession for the last 6 years. This is going to wash very, very deep into the middle class of South Africa. And people you and I know are going to lose their businesses. They're going to lose their homes. They're going to have cars repossessed. And they're going to have to take their children out of the schools that they've been in and look for other alternatives. And it's going to be the first middle class economic recession for about 50 years. And that's significant. We've seen just in the last day, a company like Comair, which has been viable since 1946. It's weathered the global economic crash. It's weathered many things, now going into business rescue. And they're going to be followed by many, many, many more companies. So when we get out of the stage 4, stage 3, and people start drifting back to their places of work, many of those won't be there anymore. And that's a big, big concern. And that should be something which we're all obsessing about now. Yeah. And it makes it absolutely the right call to have made that 2 weeks into the lockdown, that we've got to focus on lives and livelihoods.
And of course, the fact that we have lost so many trillions to state capture doesn't help at all, because we have no buffer. So John, what would you do if you were making the decisions that we would have to follow? What would your plan be?
Well, the plan is already there on the table, and we've presented it to government, and we put it out there as an alternative. The smart lockdown model is the right way to go. Our level 4 was a far more opening up of the economy, but it's also important that you manage the virus for the next 18 to 24 months. And the smart lockdown model allows you to do that. Everybody knows the spike is coming down the line. And what the smart lockdown model allows you to do is get businesses going. If you need to lock down for another 2 weeks, you lock down hard again, and you stop the curve. You flatten the curve and stop the spread. And that's how we're going to have to manage it. But just keeping the economy in this hard lockdown is devastating. The second thing I would do, and I think the president and his team are right, the economic stimulus package is absolutely essential. But we mustn't regard the economic stimulus package as the panacea. It's essentially, I can describe it as a jumpstart to the vehicle in order to get it to the garage to have the major overhaul that it needs. So there's some deep economic reforms that are going to be required pretty soon if we're going to ensure that we don't fall into the same trap prior to COVID that kept us so low in the water. And I mean, you've spoken about state capture, and I think there's some questions to be asked about why, when South Africa needed the support, the pantry was bare. It had been looted by the rats and mice, through the back door, and there wasn't anything there to help people. And the bulk of the funding has been private sector funding. But we're going to have an economic reform. And then I think we've got to readjust our politics, Howard. I think that we can't go back to business as usual. I think that we're going to require the best talents across all parties to be sitting around the decision-making table working out what are the 15 to 20 things we can do to get South Africa out of this crisis that it's in and moving forward. And so I think this adversarial approach that has dominated our politics, these ideological debates, I think need to be put aside. And we need to all work in the best interests of South Africa. And, that may well mean the president bringing on board people from other parties to help out in this time, to get us through this crisis. Now it's not a time for partisanship. It's a time for the best minds in the country to be sitting around the table, planning our recoveries that we're able to pull out of the dive that we're in and get ourselves onto a growth path again.
Absolutely right. John Steenhuisen, thank you. Before I let you go, how are you managing? Are you able to work?
Yeah, frustrating. But as I said a bit earlier, I'm working harder than ever before. I'm in back-to-back meetings, and you can't escape. Zoom can find you wherever you are. So,
wherever you are.
It's also good. It's a disruptive moment for businesses, and I think it's going to force all of us to reassess how we conduct our businesses. We're able to have party meetings. Looks like we're probably going to end up having a digital congress later this year. It's unlikely we'll be able to come together 3,000 people in a hall to elect leadership. So we're going to have a digital congress. Our policy congress is moving on to online platforms. So I think it is forcing some changes, but there's no escaping that little camera at the top of your computer, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. Look, I certainly believe that with the change and with the difficulty comes tremendous opportunity. And I do think that this forces the change that perhaps we've needed in many areas as well. It forces government to listen to people like yourselves, where maybe they would have not bothered to do so for some, unless they were absolutely forced to. So I do think that there is potentially positive aspects that come out of it. John Steenhuisen, thank you for taking the time. John is the South African politician serving as the leader of the opposition in the National Assembly. Thanks for taking the time. I'm Howard Feldman. This is the Synthesis Podcast.